Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. So today we're going to be looking at a very historically notable album. This is going to be a retrospective on the John Lennon and Yoko Ono album Double Fantasy, which came out in 1980. And the reason for this is I've just come back from Liverpool from a very enjoyable weekend where I met up with John Heaton and a few of his friends, and John was there for the Beatle convention. If you want to hear about that, you can go and check out his video on his channel. I just went for one night, and we went along to a great show, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we also spent some time driving around Liverpool, going to some historical sites. We went to all the various Beatle homes, Fourth Lane Road, Mendips, etc. Again, John will give you a bit of a travelogue account of that. Great fun, really amazing to finally visit those particular locations. And we went to a show at the Philharmonic Hall, and that was really what inspired me to go back to Double Fantasy, because it was the John Lennon 1980 band. So it was three musicians who'd played on this record, along with some others. So from the Double Fantasy sessions, the band consisted of Tony Levin on bass, obviously an incredibly well-travelled musician. He's played with everybody from Peter Gabriel through to King Crimson and John Lennon, etc. There was Earl Slick on lead guitar, and I guess his most famous CV line would be playing with David Bowie, and Andy Newmark on drums, who again has played with everybody. He played with Sly Stone and Roxy Music and Squeeze, of course. And on vocals there was Mark McGann, who's played John Lennon on stage and on the big screen. Did a fantastic job. So it was a really powerful experience watching these guys playing this music, and apparently they'd had no rehearsal. They'd met up the day before and learned all these songs, which they hadn't played really since 1980, you know, when they played on this record. So that just gives you some sense of what stunning musicians they were. And what they did was they used little clips from the studio sessions, so you could hear John Lennon in between the songs. You could hear him giving instructions to Jack Douglas, the producer, and giving advice to the musicians. It was really kind of spine tingling. And when I look back, I mean, I got this record when it came out pretty much. I must confess, I am one of those people who didn't buy the record until after John's death. Now, my defence is that I was only 9 years old at the time. This came out in November of 1980, and so I would have been 9, I think. Once John had been taken from us, I got this record probably in about January of 1980. I got this, and at the same time I was given, my parents bought me a copy of Rock and Roll Music Volume 1 by the Beatles. And these two records, I just kind of sat and listened to them non-stop for weeks, months on end. And Double Fantasy probably is among the first maybe 10 to 15 records I ever owned, long-playing records. So to see these guys on stage playing that music live, it was a real spine-tingling moment, really. So when I got home, I thought, okay, it's time to pull out the vinyl, which I hadn't listened to for many, many years. So I thought I could just briefly do a video and talk about some of the music on this record. Not going to go too in depth, I don't want the video to be too long. I guess the first thing to say about this record is that it was a big comeback for John. I think he'd been away for 5 years. His previous studio album had been Walls and Bridges, and it was seen as being a big comeback. It was a big comeback. I think at the time there was probably a little bit of disappointment that he carved up the record with Yoko. We hadn't had any John Lennon songs for 5 years. There are 14 songs on this album, 7 of them are by Yoko, and I'd like to think that by that point most of the real vitriol and hatred which Yoko was on the receiving end of at the early end of the 1970s had largely passed over. I think there was still some disappointment that John hadn't taken the whole record for himself. And it was pretty clear from the picture on the front, just the iconography of it, that he'd gone right back. He picked up where he'd left off, really, from those early albums. You think of Imagine and Mind Games, where he was forever writing really about himself and Yoko and his relationship, and the fact that I think he felt that Yoko had completed him in some way, that he was no longer a complete person unless Yoko was there. They'd been through some bad times, of course. Around about the time of the Mind Game sessions, they'd had a bit of a falling out, and they had a bit of a separation as well, but clearly they came back together. And I think some critics were a bit put off by this idea that it was another album where John was singing about his marriage. There were some fairly unkind reviews along the lines of, oh God, why is he writing about Yoko again? But what can you say? John was nothing if not honest all the time about where he was in his life. And having spent 5 years in the wilderness and then spent 3 of those bringing up a young son, Sean, I guess he was ready to make another statement, and the statement that he was always going to make was about the life situation that he was in. The album was shot through with a certain optimism. There are several songs which consciously look forward to the future. I think that's one of the things that makes the record gain a lot of pathos and tragedy in retrospect. Even as early as January of '81, there are certain songs on this record that were already quite painful to listen to. But going back to the idea of it being carved up with Yoko, I think in retrospect it kind of helps the record really. I mean, one thing that struck me from listening to it again at this distance was that it's a very professional sounding recording, and that probably goes back to this idea that he was working with the best session musicians available. Tony Levin, Andy Newmark and Earl Slick, and some of the other guys on the record. I think they'd been hired by Jack Douglas, the producer really, and I guess the brief was just get the best people. This is the John Lennon album that we've been waiting for all these years, so John needs the best people. It wasn't a kind of Paul McCartney and Wings type situation where it was just round up some friends and let's go. It was definitely an attempt to make something that was going to be top draw. So the performances on the record are very professional. They're not phoned in. They're extremely good performances, very tight, very well drilled, beautifully played. But I guess the criticism you could make is that it does perhaps lack a bit of passion at times. It sounds like a band that has not been on the road, has not been road tested. The plan after the record had been made, I think, was to go on tour and use this band. I mean, that was one of the great things about the concert in Liverpool. It was almost like seeing, the band that John Lennon would have taken on the road. So the music is very professional, and John's tracks in particular are very well done. I think what Yoko brings to this record is a slight edge of lunacy. If you take her songs, Kiss, 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 I mean, when I first heard this record back in 1980, I'd never heard any Yoko Ono type music before, and I'm not sure what I made of it. I don't think I liked it or disliked it. I think I found it slightly disorientating. The song is very spiky, it's very not avant-garde exactly. I think she'd been through that phase, but there was a definite left field influence, and that comes through on some of Yoko's other tracks as well. So she does Give Me Something, which also has a bit of a jagged feel to it. I'm Your Angel, which is a kind of quirky, jazzy piano number. She does a little bit of cod reggae with Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him. And she has some more straightforward things like I'm Moving On, which is quite a powerful rocking song. But I think in general her songs probably take more risks than John's do on this record. John, I think it does slightly sound as if John was playing it safe with his material. There wasn't so much of the subversive spirit which we'd grown to know and love in the 60s. It didn't sound like he was out to rock the boat at all. It sounded more like he was just wanting to write some strong melodic material and perform it as best as he could. But of course what resulted from that was some very fine material. So you have the single Just Like Starting Over, which is very consciously modelled on 1950s rock and roll. I read somewhere that John had been inspired to do that by listening to Queen, Crazy Little Thing Called Love, which had come out the previous year, came out in, I think it was November of 1979. And right about this time, in the late 1970s and early 80s, we were on the verge of this period when there was going to be a lot of 50s nostalgia. The Stray Cats were Waiting in the Wings, and like I said, Queen were there doing Crazy Little Thing. So I think there was a kind of air of 50s nostalgia which had always been there in the 1970s, think Shawaddy Waddy. But certainly it's a good, strong song, very nice sentiment, beautiful melody, very well played. You've got Clean Up Time, which is just a fun track, probably one of the ones that you'd point at and say not particularly challenging, either musically or lyrically. And as a song, it reminds me a little bit, perhaps not musically, but lyrically, of the early 1970s McCartney work, where John is basically singing about home, family, domesticity, trying to get himself straight. Clue is in the title, Clean Up Time. It's a fun song, but I don't think it's necessarily the best John song on the record. Then you've got Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy, which is one of two songs on the record which I think it veers ever so slightly into the realm of the saccharine. I think John had learnt this lesson when he did the Imagine album back in the early 70s, when I think he mentioned to an interviewer that the trick is to get your message across but then stir a little bit of sugar into the mix in order to make it go down better, make it more palatable. On this record, I think Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy and Woman, those are the two songs I think which you could maybe argue are a little bit slushy, and that is a word that I've heard used against this record, ever so slightly on the saccharine side, but both songs, at the end of the day, both songs are beautiful. I mean, they've both got wonderful melodies, they're well sung, and they are heartfelt. I think Beautiful Boy in particular, there's a famous clip of Paul McCartney welling up listening to that song, and maybe it's one of those songs where if you've ever fathered a child, or in particular a son maybe, that song becomes very affecting. And I still do find it incredibly moving. Woman, less so. I find that one to be... It's a great song. I've got a memory of learning that song on the guitar in guitar lessons back in my school days, because it has a very straightforward and easy guitar part at the start of it. It's a wonderful song. I would never knock it. It's a John Lennon classic, but I do find that one to be slightly on the slushy side, and I think I can hear what certain critics heard. John Peel famously didn't like this record at all. I think he found it to be too slick, too professional, not subversive enough, too much erring on the side of sentimentality, and it didn't chime with him. And in a way, it didn't chime with the times. We just come through punk, the new wave thing was starting, there was a lot of edgy, interesting music around, and I think perhaps the disappointment was that John didn't seem to have tapped into that. He didn't seem to have tapped into just the edginess that was happening in music. It sounded like he'd retreated more into session musician land and perhaps made things a bit too polished. But I think it's only fair to say that this album was meant to be his relaunch, and who knows where he would have gone next. And it's more than likely that he would have hit the road after this, done a tour, and then come back into the studio, maybe with a more raw edge. Then, of course, you have Watching the Wheels, which is just one of the greatest John Lennon solo songs. A song about the fact that he'd been out in the wilderness, struggling to find it in himself to make a comeback, or really struggling to see what his place was in the music industry and why he should be playing the game. And I think of all the songs on the record, it's the one with the most serious message. It's not a navel-gazing song, but it's definitely one where John is analysing the situation that he's in and trying to find answers and solutions. And but of course what makes the song work wonderfully is just the melody and the arrangement are both incredibly uplifting. When it lifts into the chorus each time, it's a real tearjerker kind of moment. I'm Losing You on side one has a more menacing feel. It's that one came over really well in the live concert. Earl Slick did some really good guitar work in that. And I'm guessing that I'm Losing You refers back to the period in the mid-70s when John and Yoko were going through their fairly acrimonious split. So it's a song of paranoia, really. One lover to another feeling like they're losing their partner and they don't know what's happening or why it's happening. That sense of loss of control, I think, makes the song one of the more darker songs on the record. And maybe if he'd done a couple more like that, the album would have had more of an edge. So the only other John song is Dear Yoko, which is a fun song, but it seemed like one of those songs that was deliberately designed to get up critics' noses, and it's not particularly memorable. I don't think it's a particularly fantastic song. It just fills a gap in the record, I think. And because of the way that the album was sequenced, they took turns, John Yoko, but there's a John song at the end of side one, Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy, and then there's a John song at the start of side 2, Watching the Wheels. And because of that, at the end of the record, at the end of side 2, you've got 2 Yoko songs next to each other. And I think that is a bit of a shame, really. It doesn't feel right, really, on a John Lennon comeback album that John bows out 2 songs before the end. That doesn't quite sit well. And it feels to me as if side 2 needed at least another one really strong John song. I mean, there were some songs lurking in the background. Think of some of the material that came out on Milk and Honey. Nobody Told Me There'd Be Days Like These. I mean, if that song had been on side 2, even if something like Living on Borrowed Time had been on side 2 of this, I think it would have lifted it a lot. That said, the last 2 songs on the album I think are quite strong. And I do think that Yoko does a good job on this record. I mean, her song Beautiful Boys I think is a very interesting song. She sings the first verse, it's addressed to Sean, and the second verse she addresses to John. She sings, "You're a beautiful boy with all your little ploys," so it was all your little toys in the first verse, that's quite nice. "Your mind has changed the world and now you're 40 years old. You've got all you can carry and still feel somehow empty." So that's an interesting lyric. That shows, I think, that Yoko knew that John was a damaged character, and it's interesting that she was able to put that into lyrics. Bit of a contrast to John. I think whenever John sang about Yoko, you got the sense almost that he was almost deifying her in a way, and but I think Yoko had a fairly clear-eyed view of John at this point. So overall, I think this album is it's slightly unfair to judge it in a way, because I do think it was the first chapter in a story that was going to go on and develop into something, and clearly that was not allowed to happen. But given that, you know, taken on its own merits, I think it is an album which contains some really, really nice material. Do I think it necessarily contains the best John Lennon material? Probably not, apart from Watching the Wheels, which I think is a definite top 5 John Lennon classic song of all time. The rest of John's songs on this record are high quality. It is a good, good quality John Lennon. There's certainly been nothing wrong with starting with this record, and I do find the dynamic interesting that you've got the John track, the Yoko track, and the fact that Yoko's songs have this maybe slightly more subversive sound to them does make for a slightly interesting contrast. On the back cover there, of course, we have John and Yoko outside the Dakota, which was unfortunately the scene of John's death not so long after. So thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed that, and that was John Lennon and Yoko Ono, Double Fantasy. Take care, bye.